My love for the raven goes way back to my childhood, but that's a long story. So let's begin a little more recently, because my real passion for ravens exploded when I had the opportunity to raise one. But first, I must introduce you to another character. Our story begins right in my own backyard on a bright spring morning. I was setting a new scope onto my nephew's pellet rifle. The only thing breaking the morning quiet was a crow sitting on the telephone pole up above me.
Stop! Hold it! This isn't a story about crows, is it? I hate crows!
No, this isn't a story about crows. I'm not real fond of crows either. It's a story about ravens.
Well, it's the same thing, isn't it?
No, they look similar, but they are quite different.
I think you better explain.
Okay. Ravens are larger than crows, quieter than crows. I find them smarter than crows. Crows tend to live in the cities and travel in large flocks. Ravens are more country or rural and tend to travel and live in pairs. A crow weighs about 2 pounds, has a wingspan of about 3 feet, and it flaps and yaps much of the time that it's in the air. A raven weighs about 3 pounds, has a wingspan of over 4 feet, and spends much of its time in the air soaring. The birds sound very different. A crow, whereas a raven sounds more like this. And I find ravens far more expressive than crows. Most city people are very aware of crows. Rarely do they see ravens. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah, I was in the backyard with a pellet gun in my hand and a crow on a pole. I set the sight to my eye and I began to study this crazy creature. It was quite beautiful. As I looked closer at the individual feathers, I noticed the opalescent hues, green emeralds and bright purples. It was gorgeous. And I wondered, how could God give such beauty to such a vile creature? My temptation, of course, was to shoot the thing. But all of a sudden I got an overwhelming feeling, a nudge, that somehow, some way, my love-hate interest in this crazy bird was going to lead to a lesson that God himself had planned just for me. It was very real and very strange, almost discomforting. Just then, Monsieur Crow caw-cawed off into the morning. Funny, just about that time in the park where I enjoy my morning time with God, I'd been studying Genesis and the original creation. I'm fascinated by man's relationships with animals. The records of man's relationship with animals before the flood, a relation with them now, and the relationship God says he will have with them in the future is quite different. My natural curiosity set in. I asked God some questions, and they went something like this. What were the animals like before the flood? What changed it? What will they be like in the future? Then I met Bob. In July of '98, we came in possession of an adult crow that had busted up his wing pretty bad. We named him Bob, and we ended up taking care of him for about 9 months. We developed kind of a unique love for something that really can't take care of himself. Haha, but Bob hated us. He cawed, he clawed, he bit. He'd call his friends over to sit on the wires and pester us. When Bob was out and about, his friends would dive bomb us. Bob hated us. Bob's friends hated us. The neighbors thought we were weird. And I was to find out here was my lesson. For Bob was so stupid he couldn't see his own pathetic situation. For almost an entire year I had truly enjoyed the time I spent caring for a stupid, selfish creature that for all practical purposes would never return anything of the sort. Bob, throughout the entire time I had him, fed him, protected him from certain death, would always fear and loathe the very sight of me. Through this time with Bob, God had spoken to me, and I had loved something even though it gave no love back. At Bob's funeral, I was suddenly overcome with emotion and I actually felt like weeping. Not for the bird, but for something that stuck deep in my heart. For it seemed God was saying to me, "Now you know a little of how I love you." I'm not one that believes in luck, therefore it's hard to explain what happened next. It had been a year since I found Bob, and it was vacation time again. Leaving Sunday service, we spied a small group standing in a wide circle. In the middle stood a motley, splotched, pink and black thing, and I thought, not another wounded crow. Bob had been dead only a matter of weeks, and we were headed on vacation tomorrow. My wife spied it and quickly said, "Don't even think about it." I just as quickly said, "Don't worry," and I cut myself short. It wasn't a crow. Although obviously still young, it was larger than a crow, more the size of a hawk. "Wait, Diana. It's a baby raven."
Hi there. Hey, what are you doing, huh? What are you doing all by yourself? Where's Mom and Dad?
I asked if anyone knew what to do. Everyone went blank. I got a tablecloth and wrapped our willing guest and placed him in the back of the car. "What are you going to do with him?" somebody asked. "I'll take him to the wild bird hospital." My wife gave me a look. Driving home, my mind is racing. A baby raven. Of all the birds, the raven is the greatest in the sky. "Diana," I say, oozing with excitement, "understand this bird is young, really young. So young it hasn't learned to fear." She reminds me, "We leave for vacation tomorrow, and we can't take him with us." "Why not?" I'm thinking. But I say, I know, I'll figure something out." Diana's best friend, agrees to feed him while we're gone. "We need a name." "Huey, baby Huey," Diana says. Perfect. Ravens and crows are similar, but this infant was larger than any adult crow. At first feeding, our child downs half a pound of pureed scallops. He steps back, blinks his eyes, then came back for more. Diane and I look at each other, smiled at our child's wonderful appetite, and waited to let Diane, the babysitter, have a go. Diane came, repeated the process, and laughed as she left. We knew they'd get along just fine. Driving up through California along the coast brings you through a vast array of mini climatic zones, from sandy deserts to pine forests, along marshes and scrub areas, some flat, some hilly, some on the edge of mountains, all open, all raven country. This was one of the longest vacations I ever took. Ravens on the beach, ravens in the trees, ravens soaring effortlessly above us, beside us and below us. Even stuffed ravens in the national parks exhibits. Diana's eyes began to distinguish the diamond tail of a raven as opposed to the cut-off tail of a crow, even when the bird was high in the sky. She learned the difference between the annoying caw-caw of a crow and the much softer and soothing rock, rock, rock of a raven. We spent a lot of time watching many different birds glide and soar. Upon watching an adult peregrine falcon teaching her two young ones the amazing aerobatics falcons are famous for, I nudged Diana and said with a serious smile, "Ravens are better flyers." "Rick, what if he's not alive when we get home?" "Then it wasn't meant to be," I said. Silently I asked God about it. It was late in the afternoon when we finally pulled into the driveway, and I gave a heavy sigh as I turned off the car. I opened the back gate for Diana, and immediately a very loud squawk emitted from the backyard. We each looked at each other, and I most happily said, "I hope he hasn't been like this all week," but I really didn't care. I was home, and instinctively I knew this was the beginning of another amazing relationship. A raven matures pretty quickly. They go from egg to hatchling in just about 20 days, and then from a hatchling to a full flying bird in just about 20 days. Hugh's going to go from just walking to out and flying very quickly.
Thank you. Are you throwing stuff at me? You are, aren't you?
Now, as much as I disliked the idea of having to let Huey go, ravens belong in the wild, and so we decided right away we needed to get this bird back to the wild as quickly as possible. This created quite a dilemma. Huey, being a baby, needed attention and food all the time, and the bird does what's called imprinting, where he thinks you are his parent. And and this meant he wanted to be everywhere we were. Huey loved to eat, and Huey loved to play, and I had to beat the sunrise every morning for both feeding and playtime, because if I didn't, he'd wake up the entire neighborhood with his very loud squawking. But during normal daylight hours, everybody was Huey's friend. If you came within sight of him, think about a couple of miles, he'd dance around in circles and squawk until you came to see him. If you had food, all the better, but a finger through the cage would do. Many people would be a little apprehensive at first. Their look to me was, what kind of nut is this to keep a mangy, still pink and blotchy black, crow in a cage at his house, or worse, in front of the restaurant? I told him, it's not a crow, it's a raven. Two entirely different birds. Then I'd tell him to go pet him, and that was it. They fell for him too. In fact, until Huey could fly, Huey was everybody's friend. Everybody loved Huey. The real lessons in life hurt a loving parent far more than a child. We knew we had a very special responsibility, because in order to get Huey ready for the wild, we had to do exactly what we didn't want to do. We had to begin by letting him begin to feed on more of what he'd find in the wild. This was impossible for Grandma, who liked nothing better than throwing the birds white bread and Rice Krispies. Dinah got brave one time and bought Huey live mice. She watched that once, and that was enough for her. But far more difficult was the fact that somehow we had to teach Huey to fear. He had to fear and fend for his life, otherwise he'd lose it. How do you do that? How do you teach a creature to fear and hate all that would harm them when all you want to do is love and care for it? Huey truly thought he was everybody and everything's friend.
Hello, little one.
We knew the local dogs, cats, owls, merlins, kites, other hawks, were counting on just that. So back out of the cliffs, back to the Creator, I asked God, what do I do? I got the usual answer. Wait. Wait and be patient. Now Huey was free to leave his cage and wander about the yard. He'd be content to walk and hop most of the time. Every once in a while we'd see him stretching and flapping his wings, especially if he was close to your ankles, and by using them you could catch up to them quicker. Yeah, then he'd be sure to use them. We ended up buying those Aussie sheep boots for the whole family to protect our ankles, but being leather, we also found he loved to play with them. He especially loved to chase and tease Grandma and hers. We'd also see him spreading his wings, sunning himself. A couple of times he'd flap or crawl up a tree and then sit and perch for a while. How were we going to get him to use them? One day, I decided it was time to teach him to fly. So we took him out to the back of the church, which was all open land where we had found him, so at least if he got away, he'd be home. And in all my wisdom, I got together a fishing pole and rigged a line so he could go quite a distance and not get lost. We climbed up a hill, threw him high into the air, and set him free. With the very first cast, he glided beautifully, very majestically, but a lot further than I had figured, and then I noticed he was headed right for a barbed wire fence. He gave a single graceful thrust of both wings and cleared the fence and continued to glide as I marveled, watching the different wings and tail feathers work in the air, almost magically, seemingly independent of any thought, yet in perfect harmony to the task. I was mesmerized by this engineering splendor until the stupid line I had attached to his leg ran out. Dong! He crashed to the ground, and my wife's face said, "Lesson over." We went home and played with him instead. 2 days later we were playing, and then all of a sudden he just took off on his own. Not very far, but he was airborne. Then, oh my, he's over the gate. He's across the street. He's flying. He went across the street the other way, now up onto a rooftop. And being up on the roof gave Huey an incredible height advantage he had never had before. The next thing I knew, Huey was way over my head, clearing all the trees and clear off our block and on to the next. Long story short, he ended up in a neighbor's backyard and got beat up pretty badly by a couple of small dogs. Hence his first lesson in fear. He shook and shivered as he sat quietly in his cage, and he didn't come out for 2 days. But from then on, Huey became the bane of the dog world. Those two that mauled him, he'd dive bomb them to get their attention. Then he'd perch and preen just out of their reach. They'd literally wear themselves out trying to get to him. I caught these 3 young ravens teasing this dog over Catalina Island. What's amazing is these birds have only been flying a matter of weeks. Huey also learned to pick the latch on the neighbor's gate. This answered the question to who let the dogs out, but it was weeks before we finally caught him. Then we found out why. He'd steal their food and hide it in our yard. Our neighbor had to change the latch to a lock. The day Huey came out after the mauling, grandmother was a bad girl in her words, and shared her afternoon ride with him, and he destroyed the yard. I'll tell you, there's no way 12 golden retriever puppies could have done more damage, and we were the ones that learned the message here. For we found that by mixing a 90-year-old grandmother with wine and a raven learning to fly, you really have something to fear. We had this hat made just for her. She wore it pridefully. Diana replants flowers constantly. With Huey, they'd last a day, 2 max. Then every flower and bud would be ripped off. At first it was annoying, but guess what? Where there was 1, now there were 3. The bird taught us how to pinch and to get a better flowering plant. I've heard of learning from nature, but this is ridiculous. Unbeknownst to us, Huey planted nasturtium seeds everywhere, and still to this day, we always have wild nasturtiums all year long. I'm convinced whenever you see wild nasturtiums in the canyons and on the cliffs, wild ravens are near. Huey was so much fun to play with, I did everything I could to beat the morning's first light so I could be with him. In fact, I only missed a couple of days the entire time he was with us. I fed him, and then we'd play for about an hour.
Hello. You want to play with my feet, huh?
Then he'd run off with his crow buddies. But he'd be back about 8:30 or 9 o'clock, and he and Diana would play.
Oh, hi there.
His favorite game was Attack the Snake. Using a 5-foot-long purple pool float, you'd grab one end and move it like a snake, and he'd spend close to an hour attacking that thing. Sometimes he'd get real low to the ground, spread his wings, and wag his tail feathers like a dog. And then he'd jump high in the air and come pouncing down, using his claws like a cat, stabbing and tearing at it with his beak, all the while wildly screaming at his menacing purple snake. To see it, you'd think it was a life and death situation.
Morning, Huey. Want to play with your snake? Huh? Good boy.
Huey came as soon as he saw us.
Huey! Good dive, Hugh. What you doing, buddy?
We'd see him following our car for blocks to meet us or beat us home. At home, he might be hundreds of yards off playing with his crow buddies high in the air, but if he saw you, he'd come diving down and land somewhere close. Then there were the times that he had to land on you. You'd put your arm out if you were paying attention.
Oh, hi there.
If you weren't, or you were carrying in groceries or something, this blur would come out of nowhere and land on your shoulder, your back, or your head.
Where'd you get out of my face? Found a friend, huh? Nice dive.
Huey became a master of the air. He went from gliding with a couple of flaps and swoops to dives, cut and rolls, upside-down twirls, and could change direction instantly. He could fly tip to tip and defend himself against anything in the air. Watching him with his claws out and swinging while in any position was quite entertaining. With some birds, I wondered if he was trying to defend himself, or if he was amusing himself by teasing them. Huey used his beak like a dog, his claws like a cat. He danced, he ran, hopped, scooted, shuffled, crouched, barked, whistled, screamed, grunted, and flew. And with his 52-inch wings, he could really push some air, and whoosh, whoosh, he was gone, or right back on top of you. His choice.
Hi there.
We found out very quickly Huey loved French fries, and I have lots of stories, but here's my favorite. At first light, I had a bunch of French fries we had gotten just for him. I usually gave him one at a time. Once in a while, he'd take 3 to 5, fly off and hide them, and come back for more. One day, he just started packing them back in his throat. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14? This was very unusual. Finally, he had had enough, and he flew about 30 feet, where he proceeded to spit them all out. I watched very curiously as he then proceeded to pick them all up one by one, but this time he made sure they were all sticking out both sides of his mouth. Now he looked like he was carrying a good-sized bundle of sticks. And he kind of crouched himself down as if he was hiding or something, and he just watched. I chuckled to myself and I said, "Huey, what you doing?" Moments later, a crow flew right over him and he didn't move. Then a second one went by and he spread his wings, and he still crouched very low and his tail began to beat up and down. About 5 seconds later, I witnessed a group of about 6 or 7 about to pass, and as soon as they got directly over him, he jumped up and flew right smack in the center of them, and now they were all headed directly at me. They passed only about 5 feet over my head, with the obviously larger Huey doing the most amazing aerial acrobatics, twirls, spins, cuts, and dives all the time, while the smaller crows were trying to dive at him in a desperate attempt to get at the French fries. I watched them as long as I could, even running out into the street. As they got into the distance, it looked like a huge bomber was in a dogfight with half a dozen little attack planes all in fast forward. As far as I could tell, Huey just kept teasing them, and they never got any of the fries. I was baffled by this playful behavior, and it was hard to fathom what I had just witnessed. Diana, you're not going to believe this. From that point forward, Huey just became a master at teasing the crows. He'd come screaming through the yard with one in tow constantly, and it seemed to be his great pleasure to show off and show how he could outfly the crows. Many times he'd just go and get one from the gang, bring it over, and just circle the house and continue to let the crow attack him.
Sure, Huey. Up on my feet again? Hey.
Huey also enjoyed teasing us by playing dead, and he'd just lay somewhere in the yard and just with feet up in the air, barely breathing, waiting for us to come and find him. And we would, and he'd jump up and scream and take off, and he just seemed to get the biggest kick out of it.
Oh, you'd rather play than eat? Huh? You'd rather play than eat? Hello? Hello? Was that a hello? Did you say hello? Hello?
This was Gumma's favorite thing about Huey, and he would entertain her for an hour or two a day. After he learned to fly, he began talking every day. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he'd come home from wherever he was and sit in one of Gumma's trees and just talk. He had a repertoire that contained what seemed like hundreds of ruffs, gruffs, smirkies, grow-rocks, rocks, rocks, whistles, barks, grunts, snorts, and all kinds of innumerable count. Some sounded like running water through a tube. Sometimes he mimicked human words. A dog, a cat, or something some other animal would make. He made other sounds that I can't even begin to describe because I've never heard anything else like it. It was really wild, and I've heard crows go through a similar stage, but I've never heard of any taking it to the duration Huey took his recitals to. Perhaps because he had nothing to fear, he felt safe staying in one spot for so long. Diana watered the flowers every day, and Huey taught her how he wanted to be bathed. She'd pour his bath for him, and he'd splash and play like a toddler, except for the times when he was all business. Then he would preen for about 20 to 60 minutes, and then they played.
Hey, you following me?
A raven is always on the go. If it sees something or wants something, it goes for it, which means it's either always moving or always looking for something that is. If there's others around, Huey was a part of it. Didn't matter if it was human, bird, or animal. He was in the middle. I found only 3 things that calmed him. First, and fortunately, ravens are day birds and are naturally calmed by the dark. And thank God, for if these energetic pranksters were out at night, believe me, the night would certainly be far more frightening. I also found that if it was just him and I could play my guitar and he would sit for about 20 to 30 minutes. It appeared he was fascinated by the shining and vibrating strings. There was one other thing that calmed him, Diana's finger. Diana would sit and he'd get up on the table or sit in her lap, and she'd stick out her finger and he'd gently take it in his mouth all the way in so that the finger was literally down his throat. Then there he'd sit, perfectly calm and quiet, for about 20 minutes or more. She could pat him, but she didn't have to. She could stroke his back, but she didn't have to. He'd just sit there, and it was kind of like a pacifier. Now he'd do this with me also, but with me he'd be content for about 2 or 3 minutes. Then that would be it. It seemed he'd sit forever with Diana. Strangest thing.
Hey there. You gonna talk to me this morning? Yeah? What are you gonna say, huh? What are you gonna say?
Having been trained to think scientifically all through school, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I couldn't help but make observations concerning all aspects of Huey's development and life the entire time he was with us. First, ravens have incredible personalities.
You got a story to tell?
They're kind of a wonderful combination between the wise old owl, the ever-playful puppy, and the cat that thinks it's a dog. Can you imagine all 3 of those rolled into one? Sounds like fun? More fun still was the fact that many times you could easily tell what they were thinking because their emotions could be displayed in their appearance. Their eyes are very expressive. It's hard to tell in the wild because you're actually so far away and their eyes are so dark. But being inches to a few feet away, you saw what they saw. In addition to this was their featherly displays, and they have quite a range, from frightfully fierce to very comical. A raised full feathery crown could mean, I'm going to dominate or destroy you. The same full feather head display with extended neck means, I'm curious about this thing I'm about to destroy. Partial feathered tufts, called ear tufts because they look like ears, was, I'm not sure about this thing I want to play with or destroy. A low crouch with wings half open could mean, don't bother me, I'm sunning myself,
or the next step you take closer, I'm going to pounce on you or completely destroy that thing you were carrying. A cocked head was, what? Both eyes forward, almost crossed meant, move that finger any closer and I'm going to nip it. Huey also had ADD to the max. He was the I want to be here, there, and I want everything now type. When I tell people I was taking care of a raven, I'd hear, oh, ravens and crows are really smart. Or, ravens are the highest on the bird evolution. I'd have a good chuckle because as far as being smart, they're still bird brains. Bob the Crow played an out-of-sight, out-of-mind game. He'd see me and start a nervous dance, pull his head back behind a pole, and because he couldn't see me, I wasn't there, so he'd stop dancing. But as soon as he'd move his head, I would magically appear, and the nervous dancing would start again. Now, the evolution bit. Personally, I don't buy it. Right after Huey learned to fly, we were playing on the roof. All of a sudden, he stopped and crouched down low. I looked around and saw nothing. Then, seconds later, a hawk went speeding by, and off Huey went to chase it out of his neighborhood. Instinctively, he knew foe. Instinctively, he knew territory. Instinctively, he knew, chase it out of here, it doesn't belong here. This is but one of many examples I could give that demonstrate to me there is no doubt it is God that is pre-written in their hard drive to recognize things that they would encounter throughout their life. My scientific dealings with nature leads me to believe that animals are sort of like God's living computers. Think about that. For just as man is now attempting to create machines to do his work for him, God, right from the beginning, pre-programmed his machines to take care of his earth for him. He made man to manage these machines, but he also gave us many incredible gifts. Think of the color, variation, the entertainment.
There we go. Showing off. No kid. Whoa.
Mind-boggling innovations. And realize everything man makes is a poor copy of what already exists in nature. But God went beyond that. He gave them a soul. And these are special animals that are aware of something besides themselves and can actually have a relationship with man. I'm pretty certain a raven is one such creature. Huey reminded me of the importance of getting off the couch and why we need to get back into the natural world and live life how God intended us to live.
As time went by, Huey began showing his wilder side more and more. We knew the day was nearing when Huey would leave us. He was off with his crow gang on the other side of town much of the time. He wasn't eating as much, which meant he was foraging for his own food, which was good, but playtimes were getting quite rough, and he drew blood or bruised us pretty regularly. We had to keep him and Gumma separated. I worried what he might be doing with the neighbors who had known him all this time. Worse, what about the ones that didn't know him? He still wasn't entirely afraid of humans. Christmas, 1999. I got Diana and Mr. Grumpy up extra early, and the three of us celebrated Christmas in the dark with a mini tree, colored glass ornaments, which he broke, and wrapped packages of canned tuna, shiny pennies, dimes, nasturtium seeds, and more. Early New Year's Day, as I was up on the roof, Huey came screaming by with 4 other ravens in tow. He circled around, leading the pack, and they went in and out of trees, diving, circling, talking to each other like kids playing follow the leader at high speed. Huey lit on a tree very close to me, looked straight at me, and then took off like the wind, keeping ahead of his pursuers. He did not roost in the shed that night, nor have we seen him do so since, although every once in a while when we get home late at night I'll tease Diana and look in the shed and say, "Huey," just for fun. There's so much more I could share, and with Huey it was a different adventure every day. He's one pet I'll never forget. In fact, I keep a silly little collage of some of my favorite pictures of him in my walk-in closet, and we put together a little museum of some of our favorite memorabilia. Feathers, some things he liked to play with like rocks, dimes, nasturtium seeds. And this little statue reminds me of our daily routine of Huey playing with his purple snake. And then there's my favorite silver Tostavon I got in Burgundy when I was studying the wine regions of France. He would sit on my arm as he ate from this silver cup.
Eating out of your silver cup, you're such a spoiled brat.
There are hundreds of stories I could tell about this silly bird. One day I saw Huey out at the cliffs, and I realized my questions had been answered. What were the animals like before the flood? Simple, they were like Huey. They were fun and loving. We actually had to teach Huey how to fear.
Hey, Huey, what are you doing, huh? What are you doing? You want to come down and play? You want to come down and play? Huh? What are you looking at? What are you looking at?
After the flood, the animals became more like Bob, hateful and afraid. But I find in Isaiah 11 and 65 that one day the animals, even the predators, will be vegetarian again. So it should come as no great surprise that this time with Bob and Huey has given me a great hope for the future. My time with Huey reinforced the idea that the real key to the full appreciation of life is a loving relationship, and that it can even be enjoyed in the wildness of nature.
Oh, yeah.
Since Huey, my curiosity for the wild ravens exploded, so we spent a lot of time watching and filming wild ravens all over the western United States. The running joke is that every raven is Huey. And believe me, we've had some amazing encounters with these birds everywhere we go.
Okay, drop now. Did you see that? That was beautiful. Did you see that?
And especially the concept of play. And believe me, when it comes to play, I'll put my ravens against anything in the animal kingdom. It's quite possibly only monkeys, apes, and dolphins can compete with ravens when it comes to serious play.
People are wondering, what the heck are you doing taking pictures of your dumb crow? You know, and that's what they do, too. They'll come up to me and go, why are you interested in a crow?